once multi-billion-dollar company.
Vice Media was once one of the hottest names in new media.
Everybody's looking at us because we're hot and we're new media. We're new media, not old media. And we have the demo that everybody wants, which is millennials, and we're just trying to do what we're trying to do.
Just a few years ago, they had a multi-billion-dollar valuation.
You're close to generating $1 billion in revenue, or?
That's the plan, yeah.
Within the next, what?
12 to 18 months.
They really did push the boundaries. They were sort of fearless in their reporting. It brought this whole new way of approaching a subject and really challenge what we do. So why are they not successful?
If you were tuned to pop culture in the 2010s, then you know it was impossible to escape Vice. No, we don't mean drinking, drugs, and partying, though that's going to come up later in this video. Don't worry. We mean Vice, the Canadian-American media company that's been at the forefront of entertainment and journalism for years. This company was behind such iconic documentaries like Fyre, the greatest party that never happened, which exposed the infamous Fyre Festival, and Make the World Greta Again, which followed climate activist Greta Thunberg.
We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Being at the cutting edge of journalism, Vice Media was a hot corporate property. In the same decade, Vice saw hundreds of millions of dollars in investment from 21st Century Fox, TPG Capital, and A&E Networks. Now, just a few years after these decade-defining creative wins and financial backing, Vice has filed for bankruptcy.
Vice Media has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The news coming early Monday morning and represents the latest defeat for the digital media space.
This comes months after the company canceled several projects already in development and laid off staff. So, what went wrong? How could a company that was valued at $5.7 billion a few years ago be going bankrupt? And is there any hope of Vice recovering from this setback? Stick around and we'll dive right in. Before we can get into Vice's fall, we want to take you through its rise. More specifically, we'd like to get into how the media empire we knew as Vice came to be. Fun fact, did you know that Vice wasn't always called Vice? All the way back in 1994, three Canadians, Shane Smith, Tarush Alvi, and Gavin McInnes, got funding from the Canadian government to launch a magazine called Voice of Montreal. The idea for this magazine was that it would cover the edgier topics that mainstream publications wouldn't want to touch. Honestly, that sounds on brand with what Vice does even today. Well, this little magazine was a hit, and within 2 years, it had changed its name to Vice and got $4 million in funding to move operations away from the Great North to New York City. Things really started to pick up, and soon, international editions of Vice sprung up in regions like the UK. The thing to note about Vice is that it stayed true to its edgy roots and tackled topics other publications wouldn't. No one was quite doing it like them. By the turn of the century, Vice began turning its attention to other forms of media. Its formula had worked with print, but what about TV and online? The world was about to find out. The 2000s will be remembered as a time when video ruled everything. MTV dominated the airways. The world developed a taste for reality TV, and more than ever, consumers wanted to watch their content and not just read it. Vice saw the shift, and in 2006 began working on establishing digital video mediums for itself. To do this, Vice teamed up with one of the biggest forces in pop culture, MTV. Together, they launched VBS.TV, an online TV network. VBS.TV quickly gained a following for its original documentaries like The Vice Guide to Travel and Epically Latered, which were about, you guessed it, edgy topics other mainstream platforms weren't covering. Think documentaries about drug use in Colombia, the suicide forest in Japan, and the dictatorship in North Korea.
We just got back from North Korea, and all I can say is, holy fuck.
After getting its foot in the digital video sector, Vice's management decided that it was time to branch out to create more specific platforms for its different areas of interest. It was during this time that many of the Vice-owned media brands that we've all heard of came to be. Think of Vice News, which was all about current events, Motherboard, which was all about tech, and Noisy, which focused on music. While Vice stayed true to its more experimental roots, these different factions allowed the company to find more mainstream audiences. If you didn't want to watch documentaries about the local underground music scene, you could always watch and read Vice content about tech or news. It was the best of many worlds. As the 2000s rolled to an end, Vice saw some changes in leadership, with McInnes leaving the company, but it also had ambitious plans to do even more. After all, this once grassroots publication had gotten to a very comfortable place in the media world. Imagine what could happen with more funding. There's no need to imagine, because in the years that followed, Vice scored some very powerful allies and launched projects that would solidify its place on the world stage. The 2010s saw Vice change up its business model a little bit. VBS.TV, the online TV network that had become a major part of its operations, was shut down. Instead, Vice's documentaries were aired on its YouTube channel and website. And boy, were these some interesting documentaries, but we'll get to that later. Not only was Vice distributing its content in a new format, but it also had new funding. From who, you may ask? First, there was 21st Century Fox, which bought a 5% stake in Vice for a whopping $70 million in 2013. The next year, A&E Networks, which is owned by Disney and the Hearst Corporation, spent $250 million on a 10% stake in Vice. In 2017, TPG Capital invested $450 million in Vice Media, most of which was to go towards its expansion. This also brought the valuation of the company to a mind-boggling $5.7 billion. Needless to say, Vice Media had a lot of money to spend, and it certainly did. If there's one thing that Vice is known for, it's documentaries. Given that it got its start covering some of the less mainstream topics in society back when it was a magazine, it comes as no surprise. And during its heyday in the 2000s and 2010s, this was translated to its video efforts as well. But things were a bit different because Vice was able to reach a wider audience thanks to its YouTube channels and partnerships with major streaming networks. Remember when we said that Vice was making some very edgy documentaries? These were a mix of the seedy underworld that Vice had been covering for decades, as well as topics with more mainstream appeal. Take Fyre, the greatest party that never happened, a documentary produced by Vice that aired on Netflix in 2019.
There's this new festival coming up. It's really exclusive.
The most insane festival the world has ever seen.
Biggest event in a decade, I promise you. I'll be there.
But we didn't know anything.
Glamorous, luxurious, Caribbean.
Island getaway turned disaster.
Quickly spiraling into chaos. Now the event's co-founder is facing up to 20 years in prison.
Most of us know the story. The Fyre Festival was supposed to be the hottest music festival in the world, and Billy McFarland, the man behind it, had commissioned some of the biggest stars on the planet to promote it. Fyre Festival ended up being a dumpster fire of an event that captured the public's fascination, which led to the Vice-fronted documentary. It was a smashing success, getting positive reviews, becoming a hit with over 20 million viewers in the first month, and scoring 4 nominations at the 71st Primetime Creative Arts Emmy Awards. There were other creative successes, like Hate Thy Neighbor, which followed the lives of several controversial groups around the world, and Make the World Greta Again, which followed climate activist Greta Thunberg just as she was rising to global recognition. These were not just creative wins, though. Vice's coverage of such topics that were hot within the cultural zeitgeist meant that the company was more relevant than ever. But did this make Vice's content more profitable? Hollywood seemed to think so, and soon came the deals with several streaming giants that would put Vice's content in front of even more eyeballs. By the 2010s, it was clear that Vice was making content that people, especially millennials, wanted to see. It wasn't long before Vice was inking deals with streaming services for all sorts of docuseries. We've already touched on Fyre, which, fun fact, was pitched to Vice by Jerry Media, the social media agency that helped promote the ill-fated Fyre Festival in the first place. Well, you can't say they weren't pragmatic. But besides Fyre Festival, Network acquired several documentaries from the staple of Vice Media. There was Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, about Jim Carrey's portrayal of comedian Andy Kaufman in the 1999 film Man on the Moon.
That's the moment when Andy came back to make his movie.
Hello.
What happened after was out of my control.
There was also The Most Unknown, the company's first full-length documentary to be acquired by the streaming service. And Netflix wasn't the only streaming service getting in on the action. In 2015, Vice and HBO announced a deal that would see the launch of a daily Vice newscast.
Vice News Tonight.
Vice would also get its own dedicated channel on HBO's Now streaming service. In the announcement, it was clear that Vice's cutting-edge approach was exactly what HBO execs wanted. All of us at HBO couldn't be more excited working with the Vice team and helping to tell the stories which define our world. Shane and the Vice team have produced some of the most groundbreaking and dynamic journalism anywhere, said HBO's CEO Richard Plepler at the time. The Vice streaming service partnerships were going so well that in 2020, Vice Media signed a deal with the top Hollywood talent agency WME. The agency would be representing Vice in seeking out deals for unscripted projects. It seemed that the sky was the limit for Vice, with Viceland coming soon after. While VBS.TV had been shut down in the early 2010s, that was not the last we'd see of Vice's original TV programming. In 2015, the company rolled out Viceland, its own TV channel. Vice had already proven that its content could be a hit with audiences a la HBO, and so Viceland was given a big push. The Walt Disney Corporation pumped an impressive $200 million into Vice to support the project, and 30 shows were developed solely for Viceland. And what were these shows like? Well, given that this was a Vice project, you weren't going to get your run-of-the-mill cooking shows and daytime soaps. Instead, viewers were treated to more lifestyle content that stayed true to Vice's usual style. Rapper Action Bronson presented a cooking show called F*** That's Delicious.
Nah, I'm ready to eat one.
Actor Elliot Page went around the world exploring LGBT culture for Gaycation, and feminist icon Gloria Steinem explored the lives of women all around the world for a show titled, you guessed it, Woman. While Viceland now goes by the name Vice TV, it's still going strong, airing in the US, Canada, France, Australia, New Zealand, Benelux, and Israel. By the mid-2010s, Vice seemed on top of the world. It had hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, partnerships with mega corporations like Netflix and HBO, and content that its audience seemed to eat up. It seemed like there was nowhere else to go but up. We now know that failure was certainly a possibility, but what caused it? In retrospect, it wasn't a single thing that caused the company to fail, but a combination of market changes, internal issues, poor financial management, and some good old bad luck. Let's break it down. One of the first signs of trouble for Vice Media came in 2019 from none other than the Walt Disney Corporation. Keep in mind that up until now, Disney had been one of Vice's biggest backers. Not only did Disney have a 10% stake in Vice through A&E networks, but after it bought over 21st Century Fox, it got another 6% stake, a 16% stake in Vice Media in total. This sizable stake in Vice cost Disney over $400 million that it was hoping to recoup. This was not to be, because in 2019, Disney essentially wrote off the investment and declared it worthless. Just a year before, the company wrote down the value of the investment to $157 million. Eventually, the company gave up on getting any of its money back. This is not the kind of news any investor wants to hear, but the truth is, cracks had started to form in Vice Media as a company a while before this. The mid to late 2010s saw the rise of the Me Too movement, with powerful men finally getting called out for their behavior towards women. These included execs from top companies in the media, and one of Vice's biggest scandals of that time had to do with its now former president, Andrew Crichton. In December 2017, the New York Times published a scathing report alleging that there had been 4 different settlements within Vice towards employees who had suffered harassment or defamation. And once this report went live, the floodgates were open. 20 other women came forward with their accounts of being harassed or witnessing misconduct taking place at Vice.
So what we know, at least from the New York Times, that we've got 4 settlements involving allegations of sexual harassment or defamation against Vice employees, including its current president. This is Andrew Crichton.
It was a disaster. A company that had been once the voice of culture was now being accused of running a toxic workplace. Its management bowed its head in shame, with Shane Smith and Sarush Alvi admitting that they had failed to provide a safe and inclusive work environment. Once the new year rolled in, it was time to clean house. The company confirmed that Crichton was taking a temporary leave while the allegations were investigated, and he eventually stepped down later that year. Vice also fired its chief digital officer, Mike Germano. Despite the damage control, some viewers began to see Vice in a new light, and it's debatable if it's been able to fully shake off the scandals. From the harassment scandal onwards, Vice entered a very tumultuous period. With Crichton out at Vice, more leadership changes were soon to come. Shane Smith, who had been at the helm of the company since its early days in Canada, announced that he was stepping down as CEO and was succeeded by former A&E Network CEO Nancy Dubik. Once Dubik came on, her priority was making Vice profitable again. Digital revenue to new media companies had been disappointing, more on that in a bit, and she wanted to turn things around. Her approach was to trim Vice's workforce and to get even more funding. How much more funding? Only around $200 million. No biggie. Dubik ended up being successful on both counts. Vice got $250 million in investors in May 2019, and the next year, the company laid off 150 members of staff. The company also made a notable acquisition of Refinery 29, a website that's very popular with young women and could bring a new audience to Vice's content. The deal was reportedly worth around $400 million and brought Vice's valuation as a company to $4 billion. But this didn't mean they were out of the woods just yet. Far from it, in fact. To put Vice's issues into perspective, the reason why the company saw a decline in the late 2010s and is now filed for bankruptcy is due to two things. One, the company was spending way too much money. We've already touched on the Refinery 29 acquisition, but Vice was burning through its cash in other ways. One of these was its expansion in the mid-2010s. In 2014, Vice Media announced a joint venture with Rogers Communications that would see the development of production facilities in Canada at the cost of $100 million. This was the same year that Vice's headquarters moved to New York City. Once Vice was set up in New York, it took on over 500 new employees and doubled its office space, with its lease alone costing $20 million. And let's not forget about the global expansion. Vice is credited with having offices in 35 countries, and that is not cheap at all. The second thing you need to consider is that the 2010s were all about new media. Think of BuzzFeed in its heyday. New media companies were the movers and shakers of popular culture, and every big corporation wanted a piece of the pie. Thus, the hundreds of billions of dollars being pumped into companies like Vice. The idea was that these companies could recoup these costs through ad revenues. But things didn't exactly pan out that way. Sure, readers were flocking to sites like Vice and BuzzFeed in 2013, but as the years went on, people turned more towards social media sites. And where viewers go, so does ad revenue. In fact, Meta and Google account for the majority of ad revenue globally, leaving platforms like Vice with very little. So you have a company that was burning through its investment and not bringing in the heaps of money it had expected, and there was bound to be a disaster. And Vice wasn't alone. BuzzFeed, Vox Media, and others have also faced financial challenges in recent times because of this change in industry conditions. Remember when we said that Dubik came on board at Vice to try and turn around its profitability? Well, after 5 years in the role, she announced that she was leaving in February 2023 after the company had failed to turn around its fortunes. She would be replaced by Bruce Dixon and Josefa Lokhandwala, who would act as co-CEOs. Around that time, rumors surfaced that Vice would be laying off staff and even possibly filing for bankruptcy. That's not good at all. The rumors ended up being true, and in April 2023, Vice announced that it would cancel its iconic Vice News Tonight show and would lay off dozens of employees. Barely a week after the layoffs were confirmed, the New York Times reported that Vice Media would be filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and was looking to sell itself. 2 weeks later, Vice Media indeed filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and publicly available documents gave a glimpse into the media empire's troubles. In August of that year, Vice was bought by Fortress Investment Group and Soros Fund Management for $350 million. This was a mere fraction of the $5.7 billion it was once valued at, which shows just how bad things have gotten at Vice. The company listed assets between $500 million and $1 billion. It also listed a number of debts, including $474.6 million owed to the Fortress Investment Group. And like so many things that Vice was involved in, it was controversial. One of its former reporters, Joseph Cox, took to Twitter, X, to reveal that while many of its staff were struggling with the layoffs, the company was paying huge bonuses to its executives. Its global TV president, Morgan Hertzson, got a $150,000 bonus. Its co-CEO, Josefa Lokhandwala, got over $133,000. And its global head of programming, Subrata D, got a bonus of more than $201,000. Keep in mind that Vice was still allegedly owing freelancers across the board. Yikes, not a great way to start its new era. After decades of being a force of new media, Vice is now facing one of its biggest challenges yet. Even with its new ownership, Vice still has to turn its fortunes around if it wants to exist in the next decade and beyond. And to be clear, this isn't a Vice problem, it's an industry one. Even if Vice curbs its spending, it still needs to bring in money to stay afloat. And honestly, that's a bit of an uphill battle. Media companies with Vice's business model have not been having an easy time adapting to changing consumer trends and capturing ad revenue. It doesn't really matter how good or engaging Vice's content is if it can't reasonably turn a profit. Mega corporations like Meta and Google have made it near impossible for other businesses to capture ad revenue, and so Vice's biggest challenge is finding a new stream of income before it becomes a relic of the past. So, what are your thoughts on Vice's bankruptcy? Do you think the media company can make a comeback? Or is this the beginning of the end? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Explorist.